We now have the presentation by Shelley, and you're very, very welcome, Shelley.
I hope I'm worth waiting for. I just said to Joe I would happy to be dropped if I was too late, but I'm really happy to be here because I think this process is really important in terms of what's happening in Ireland, and because it's so relevant, what the issues that are being raised here in Kilkenny on your site. And I haven't been involved in any direct way in Kilkenny like many of the previous speakers who would have made proposals and actual plans. So I'm really kind of an outsider, ranging around a series of problems which I see relate to Kilkenny, but not just to Kilkenny, relate to the development of Irish towns in general. I love this quote, "The Art of Seeing with Innocence," by Luis Barragan, Mexican architect, where he says that we architects need to learn the art of seeing with innocence. I also love a quote by Manuel de Sola Morales, a Spanish architect and urban thinker, and he talks about the skin of cities, and that cities need to be observed with the attention of a detective who scrutinizes the tiniest clues in its wrinkles. He says we must find the possibility of difference, even within the uniformity imposed by the functional and economic systems of modern cities. When I look, or when we look, at the Diageo site, and this is a very rough sketch, I think what's really important is the way that we map places. When we see this site, we look at a series of, maybe you could say, dislocated elements, a collage of historic ruins, the empty brewery, the scraggy backs of the Parliament Street buildings, tarmacadam surfaces, car parking, and the wonderful River Nore frontage. And if we really map and record a site, seeing with innocence, with curiosity, getting the measure not just of the physicality of the ground, but mapping the activity, dead or alive, the energy above and below ground, the history and the memory of the place in the consciousness of the community, trying to map the past and the present in a way that might suggest the future. We would then, I think, see unexpected possibilities. The immediate reaction of us as designers is to clean it all up, to make a master plan, a coherent place, a new development. But we've learned that design alone is not enough to make a successful place. To make a new place or transform an existing one has to really stop and think, which is what you're doing here this evening. To think, what is the driving force? What is the vision for this place? Sometimes it's a question of growing a place over time, a question of urban acupuncture, balancing the positive and the negative. In a time of recession, we need to find new ways of regenerating towns. Building is not always the answer. New building of quality is really important, but perhaps we need to combine the new with the ability to recycle resources, reuse and convert, make imaginative, viable interventions which will act as a catalyst for the release of new energies, social, commercial and cultural. Everybody tells us we have to ask the right questions in order to get the right answers. So how can this site, with its evacuated brewery and buildings, be reused even in the short term? What infrastructures exist which could feed another function or use? The site has been a place of production and industry, both in the distant past and the recent past. So it must have a good water supply. It must feed off the river. What other activities could this infrastructure support? The site contains big sheds. Sheds are useful for many things, for shelter, for experimental space, for cultural or educational use, as community space, exhibition space, play space. And we can see from examples in other cities how sheds can be used imaginatively. This industrial quarter redesigned by Lina Bobardi for community use, this modern art museum in Dunkirk designed by the architects Lacaton Vassal, who did a very interesting thing, leaving the shed, the old shed on the left, and building a new partner to this shed to house the air-conditioned space. In other words, keeping the rudimentary and adding another component which would allow that rudimentary space to be reused. Or this architect's office, which I'm always really jealous of because it's so huge. He bought this timber yard and occupied a shed, just building a building inside a building for his office, which you can see in the background, and occupying about 20% of the space and the rest using for a sort of ecological garden. So I suppose that would be the first question. What is it among the bric-a-brac and the collage of elements that exist that could in the short term be exploited or reused? And that before we leap, that we do think in terms of what is there as a resource. And perhaps it's really important to think that this place continues the history of production and industry, providing a new source of employment for the town. This is the same in this idea of how traditionally in other cities, industrial spaces and sheds can really house new uses in a very vibrant way. Dominic Stevens has written a really interesting book, Rural, and I really like this way that he writes about the Irish landscape, where he says it's as man-made as the skyline of Manhattan, because we're not only presented with the Irish landscape in that manner. And this sketch of your site with the contours and the river and the floodplain really makes me think about, if we think about building, that building is not always the answer, and that making new pieces of landscape in towns can be an important answer in terms of making new ground, which will lay the ground for new future developments. And this project by Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park in Manhattan, he was a combination of sociologist, engineer, and landscape architect. And in what is called, this scheme is what's called the Emerald Necklace. He made a new landscape which was both a linear park and a device for cleaning up and controlling what was a marshy floodplain. In the city of Buffalo, when asked to design a park in the middle-class area of the city, he designed a continuous landscape which wove its way through both rich and poor districts as a device for improving both while blurring class boundaries. The class boundary is not an issue here in Kilkenny, but perhaps flooding is. And making a new park in a town is a very powerful thing. So it would seem that here there is the potential of thinking about a new kind of landscape on this Diageo site as an extension or part of your new planned river walk. A working landscape which could be seen as a place for the production of energy, of food, or a piece of water engineering, as well as being a wonderful amenity for the town. In a time of recession and at a time when flooding is a global issue, perhaps a different mindset is necessary in order to find economical, imaginative ways of resolving ecological problems while making new public space. And these are just other sketches of ours, just looking at the site and the contours of the ground and its relationship with the river. And again, trying to map these conditions and to tease out what are the problems and also what are the opportunities that these problems could give us. The idea of and you've done much of this already in Kilkenny, the idea of the river as a public space, I think, is a hugely important one. And as I say, you've already started this process. We're doing work in Toulouse at the moment, and what's fascinating about Toulouse is it's also a river with a huge flooding problem. And they've built floodgates and quay walls in order to protect themselves from the Garonne River. But they've also converted their historic port activities into a series of ferry terminals, exploiting the connection that the Garonne has to the Midi Canal, which leads to the Mediterranean. Here, the river is a public space used for performances and festivals. It's a social focus in the life of the city. It's also a connector of a myriad of towns and villages, an amenity and a resource. And there's a theatrical quality about the fact that they had to protect themselves from the river, because the city somehow gets raised up and you're looking down onto the public spaces and walkways by the water. And in Switzerland, their whole landscape is engineered to give protection against its harsh climate. Snowstorms, avalanches, flooding. It's a system of barrages, dams, retaining structures, tunnels through mountains and bridges, a kind of man-made landscape. But they also have time to play and to use their resources in a very simple way. Swimming one way, which is the only way you can swim because of the enormously strong current in the Are River in the middle of the city of Bern, it's made safe by a series of grab rails and exit points on the riverbank. And in Zurich, they made a floating timber structure which forms a private swimming pool for women right in the middle of Zurich. Architecture students from the School of Architecture in Zurich recently made a proposal for Galway City. And they were inspired by the throbbing Venice lagoon, and they were inspired by the Volvo ocean race arrival in Galway. And they felt that Galway should reinvent its relationship with the sea. In the way that architecture students can and do, they made no distinction between Venice and Galway, imagining a new active, throbbing water edge. And in a stroke of genius, by mapping the history of the development of the quay edge, they proposed the stripping back of infilled ground which separates the old city quay from the sea, making a new public space full of water in the life of the city, and making a new public arrival space by boat. And this was the model they made of the project, and it was also inspired by another project at the top image, which was also inspired by Venice, which is this idea of making a public space full of water. And the square in the top image is the idea of making a reclaimed rock into a theatre, which would become a focus for the town. So I suppose what I'm saying is that Kilkenny has huge potential in the presence of the Nore. I'm sure you speak about this all the time. But there's something really magic about arriving to a town by boat, either by sea or by river. And you obviously have a huge potential to develop this here in Kilkenny. Something that we're very conscious of in general, and particularly looking at a site like this, which is not flat, which has its, again, just the sketches of the grain of the town on the left and the nature of the ground on the right in terms of contour and profile, is that very often we don't think enough in 3 dimensions. This ground of the Diageo site slopes down to the river valley. And when we look at how ground is manipulated, say in Merrion Square in Dublin, where whole streets were raised to form the social hierarchy of the Georgian house, with its sunken basement for the servants, its protective and formal entrance threshold of steps and so on, we realize that the whole landform of Merrion Square is man-made, artificial, visionary, a piece of social engineering, written about so eloquently by Neil McCullough. The ground of this Kilkenny site could similarly be manipulated, worked to form protection from the river, to connect with the river, to access the river. One could identify cheap ground, perhaps, on lower levels, perhaps prone to flooding, and more valuable elevated ground. One could identify places for temporary structure, for uses in transition, as opposed to the permanent. Street levels connecting with Parliament Street and river levels connecting with water. Commercial or working spaces under or over living spaces or play spaces. A river world and a town world intertwined. Urban plans are often lacking in a sense of contour and ground. If we thought of urban sections, we call them sections in architecture, is the jargon of architects where you cut through a person and you can see the profile. If we thought more in profile or in terms of contour or section, we could make a more complex set of interdependent relationships, like the Georgians. The The two-dimensional plan explores the rational, and the section explores the emotional, the social, the spatial potential. We need to think more in 3 dimensions, or 4 or 5 dimensions, when making new pieces of town, in order to make a rich 3-dimensional web of interdependencies, which is the nature of towns. Sorry, just go back. Your proposed new ring road. This is an image of the Diagonal in Barcelona. And I was amazed the first time we went to Barcelona, the way that they can civilize traffic by making a series of layers of streets and roads and allowing the quiet life of the street to coexist with the fast movement of the car. And you talk about your new ring road being intended to be a street. So to humanize a road, and we know so many Irish towns destroyed by horrible ring roads, to humanize a road such that it becomes a street needs 3-dimensional thinking. In Barcelona here, it is wonderfully achieved by establishing, with the cross-section of the road, these series of social layers, a series of speeds of movement, a way of allowing the space of the street to live alongside the fast movement of the car. Slip roads from fast to slow lanes, separated by trees, allow the 2 worlds to coexist within the elegant landscaped space of the boulevard and the avenue. Your ring road, new street, will be elevated. That awful bottom left-hand sketch is the scribbles of an architect trying to understand the relationship of the road back, looking eastwards towards the castle, and the fact that the road will be elevated over, let's call it, the Diageo site. And so one thinks about, how do you make a road into a street? Could it be one-sided and address the landscape of the new quarter of the Diageo site? Does it need to be 2-sided? And how can it be civilized? And if the road is raised, could you make a space like this circular space in Locarno, which is 100-meter diameter, which is a kind of stolen space or reclaimed space under a really beautiful civic space, reclaimed space under a very busy roadway, and somehow it captures a connection with the town and with the landscape in what would otherwise be waste ground. There is in Kilkenny, I'm told, the potential for a new university department or educational institution being located here in this Diageo site. Could the process of education begin now in advance of the building? The exceptional architect and urban designer Florian Bagel, in proposals for redundant brownfield sites, makes a new landscape in advance of any development. As a gesture of hope, he makes a place waiting to be occupied. Instead of this ground laying fallow in the short term, could activities be promoted here which would sow the seed for its future life? There are many examples of modest pilot projects which escalate into thriving businesses or institutions. You have examples here in this county, in activities ranging from the arts to horticulture to hurling. While restoring your existing institutions, could you facilitate pop-up cheap premises for parallel experimentation and learning? Could you give over a site for the vibrant, imaginative population of young, unemployed architects to make experimental structures, collaborating with local skilled workforce, much of whom are unemployed, responding to local needs? There is so much skill, imagination, and energy in this country being thwarted and made redundant through lack of possibilities. We have an economic recession, but we don't have a cultural recession. You're restoring and transforming important educational and cultural institutions in Kilkenny, and these are extremely important projects. But are there mechanisms which could be employed in parallel which would exploit our current condition imaginatively and revive the idea of education in its real, full, and radical sense by combining making with thinking, combining the unskilled with the skilled, combining the visionary with the pragmatic and the useful? We are doing a competition for a new university in Paris right now, and the jury or the client overlaid a plan of Oxford on the Greenfield site, which is the image at the bottom. And we just thought it was a beautiful image of these large gardens. In this case, they are to be permeable so that it makes a kind of myriad of green squares or green fields, which would become the new university. This project we did for an infill waste site between two quite rigid university departments. We called it the space between the notes because the client wanted to see if it was possible to make a temporary breakout space for students to do nothing in particular in, to have a place of laboratory, a place of experimentation, a socialized space. So we made a new shed, like a new roof, which would capture the sun and protect from wind and rain. And in Lima, we're making a university, which is like a kind of vertical garden. Hugh Campbell, professor in University College Dublin, talks about a university as being a place where knowledge is tended, not consumed, that it's looked after. And we find this a really provocative idea in terms of what education should or could be. I'm going on too long. Will somebody tell me that I need to stop? I need to stop. Yeah. Am I? Yeah, if you take another few minutes. 2 minutes, okay. 2 minutes, 3 or 4. 3 or 4. Variety is the main characteristic of the metropolitan territory. Kilkenny has a rich texture of squares, lanes, monuments, public buildings, and institutions. Like many Irish towns, not enough people live in the town, over the shop, in the streets, on the lanes, overlooking the public spaces. There is a rich variety of spaces where people, young and old, could happily live, but don't, like so many Irish towns. Too many people drive to school, drive to work, drive to shops. The life of the street suffers, the social life of the individual suffers. And Kilkenny, like Toulouse, it so happens, has an absolutely unique house type in Roth House. 25 metres wide, 100 metres long, this plot with its series of courtyards and finally a garden weaves the landscape and the town together. This house could be a model for a new house type in Kilkenny, generous and urban, private and protected, but overlooking the street, with space for vehicles, carriages, or cars, or bicycles, or animals, extended families, lodgers, a workshop, a yard, a vegetable garden. In Toulouse, this deep house type is the reverse of Kilkenny house type, because they put their servants and their rented space to the front, as opposed to Roth House in Kilkenny. But when we visited Toulouse, it seemed like a sort of a myriad or a labyrinth of miniature Roth houses. And we just thought, wouldn't that be an amazing model for a new piece of town in Kilkenny? And again, quoting Dominic Stevens, he asked the question, is vernacular a style? Or is it a way of being, a modus operandi? So I think Kilkenny could use its vernacular as a way of being and not just a style. To finish, architecture and community originate together. In an exhibition entitled Small Scale, Big Change at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 2010, the case was forcibly made that architects need to work at a different scale in order to be useful in society. This exhibition made the case for bottom-up activities as well as top-down models. The exhibition was looking for projects which were a vehicle for change, a vehicle for arresting the forces of commerce and politics in favor of the life of the human being in society, a vehicle for arresting the global in favor of the local. This case study, it's not part of this exhibition, but it's interesting, a group of architects instigating a community to contribute €10 each for the purpose of a plank of wood from which they constructed a pedestrian bridge over a motorway, is an example of a project which can bring a community together to create a piece of urban infrastructure. This housing project, on a site not unlike the Grange of Kilkenny, involves the conversion of a church and the rebuilding of a community around this church, mixing housing for old people with facilities for children. a pop-up cafe made by young architects from salvaged materials from eBay. The Buy a House for £1 scheme, recently introduced in London, originated in Rotterdam, where people were given the opportunity of buying a house for €30 in a derelict street. The conditions of sale meant the buyers had to live there for a minimum of 10 years, during which time they renovated the street and repopulated what was considered an undesirable place to live. You could, overnight, using some kind of similar model, repopulate one lane or one underpopulated street in Kilkenny. I love maps of towns because one sees the layers of history and one can get the sense of ground and the life of a town from a map. And the energy, just finished to say that the energy and the vision of a community is such a powerful tool. But without that, planners and architects are redundant. We believe in architecture in all its forms, from the most modest intervention to the making of the monumental. As architects, we are strategists, translators of need into built form, working with the imagined to make the real. Ideas influence policy, ideas become policy, and policies affect what we can build. You, as a community, are being invited to take the opportunity to use this period of inactivity to really think, to partake in bringing about the change of thinking which is so badly needed. You have time to collectively imagine and invent a new model for the regeneration which suits your town, your community. Thank you.